Good morning and welcome. Glad you are here this morning. Several have asked about Terry. I think it's 34 in the morning and 63 in the afternoon there. And they're doing well and enjoying seeing the sights. Rented a car, drove on the left side of the road. And glad to get out of the bigger cities because it was a little confusing. But Tanya has done it before in Scotland 3 different years, and Terry wants nothing to do with it. So they're doing just fine. We will be in Searcy next week for the lectureships. I'll preach at Archibald in the morning and drive up to Little Rock and pick Terry up in late afternoon and on Sunday, and then we'll be in Searcy for the lectureships. We are studying John chapter 2, and we're not going to actually look at many verses today. We want to look at Jewish weddings to prepare ourselves for the study, and we're going to spend some time looking at the Greek word for sign. It came up in our 1 Thessalonians study recently briefly, and we are going to tackle the issue of social drinking. I'm willing to just jump out into the pool, and if I drown, you be sure to hand me a helping hand. 4 words are used in the New Testament that describe what we would call a miraculous theme. The first word is the word dunamis. It's translated power or mighty work. And it's somewhat generic. It comes from the word dynamite. We recognize it from Romans 1:16, the power of the gospel. The gospel is the power unto salvation, and that's the word used there. It emphasizes the concept of power. It translates well in many of the contexts, but that word is not used in the Gospel of John. So dunamis will not be found as we go through the book. Teros is also translated wonders. It's nothing significant about it except that it does do something that would blow our mind. It's not actual, it's not common, it's not according to something circumstantial. It's very much an act that brings about something. Jesus uses the word, John 4 verse 44, he said, unless you people see miraculous signs, and there's the word semeion, and wonders, and that's the word teros. So unless you see signs and wonders, he told them, you will never believe. And so there's a reason for them, and of course, miraculous signs, wonders, heros, dunamos, have all passed for our time. Miracles existed so as to substantiate the person and his message. It gave credibility to the apostles in the first century. We looked in Acts toward the end and showed the last recorded miracle, and it was recorded around AD 48 when we looked at that a few weeks ago. The third word is ergon. It's translated works or deeds, and it usually is spoken of in the book of John with Jesus as he then talks about the glory that would be given to God. And so that word is alluded to and spoken of here. But the main word is Savion. If you look at our text this morning in our sermon, the last verse, John 2, verse 11, this is the first of his miraculous signs. That's Savion. Jesus performed in Cana of Galilee. He thus revealed his glory, and his disciples put their faith in him. It's something that points beyond itself. Jesus is going to make several hundred pints of wine out of water today in front of us through a miracle. But the purpose of the sign was not to point to the wine. The purpose of the sign was to point to something greater. It looked eventually, and the result was revealed his glory, and it brought faith. So that was the purpose. And in our discussion, when it came up in our Wednesday night study, if you go out here on the interstate and you see a sign, same word, and it says Baton Rouge, you're not in Baton Rouge. It's pointing to Baton Rouge. It's pointing to something else. So when we see street signs, it technically affirms the meaning of the word Savion. It's pointing to something else, not to itself. You haven't arrived just because you find a sign with the city where you're driving to listed there. And of course that's obvious, but John is very obvious. And in our text this morning, this is the first of his miraculous signs. There's 7 given. They're given as far as to make a point, a very specific point about Jesus, pointing to God. And the first one is here. And it shows Jesus, as those who study the book of John, I'll mention it in the sermon, he's the master of quality. Everything Jesus does is first class. It cannot be equaled by anyone else, with or without a miracle. I would love to have a piece of his furniture, since he was a carpenter, and yet that's not possible, because God knew how crazy people would be if they had one of his pieces of carpentry. They would worship the art instead of the person. And so no matter how artfully done it would be, God in his wisdom doesn't make that possible. I want to read you from Leon Morris. He gives us information as we begin looking at the Jewish wedding and the custom of it. Don't have time in the sermon, it would take time here in the class. According to the Mishnah, the wedding would take place on a Wednesday if the bride was a virgin, on a Thursday if she was a widow. The bridegroom and his friends made their way in procession to the bride's house. This was often done at night, and there could be a spectacular torchlight procession. There were doubtless speeches and expressions of goodwill before the bride and groom went in procession to the groom's house where the wedding banquet was held. It is probable that there was a religious ceremony, but the Mishnah does not provide details. The processions and the feast are the principal items of which we have knowledge. The feast was prolonged and often lasted as long as a week. When Tia and I were married 53 plus years ago, we drove out of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and we both looked at each other and we realized our jaws were very sore. Were yours that way? You're smiling, and we had a very small wedding and a very short reception, but we were smiling for that hour and 25 minutes roughly, and our muscles hurt. How would you like to go through that for a week? We were ready to get out of there. We were ready for everybody else to get out of there. So it's a big deal. Let's just be sure we understand that. They vary in location, obviously. Nothing is exact, no matter what someone would say. But it was something that was not done alone. It was something very joyful. It was something very musical. It was something with great, great celebration. We attended 2 weddings in China. And one of the things you see in a wedding in China is a whole lot of red. That is the color of celebration, and they're into traditions and colors and things like that. And when you give a gift in China, you put whatever the card and hopefully money in a red envelope. And that is the tradition. So red, red, red. And the other thing, similar to what the missionary would tell us without specificity, the music was always very, very loud. And I would imagine in this festive occasion, it would have been pretty loud as well. The Chinese believe that if the music is really loud, that is a connotation of great joy. So if it's at 8 on a scale of 10, does that mean you're less joyful if it's not on 10? Well, 8's pretty loud, was what we were thinking, and we were doing like this a whole lot. But the reality is weddings are very festive, they're joyful. If they last over a period of just a short time, obviously there's much, much more involved in people's understanding of them. Spurgeon wrote, "I commend cheerfulness to all who will win souls, not levity and frothiness, but a genial, happy spirit. There are more flies caught with honey than with vinegar, and there will be more souls led to heaven by a man who wears heaven in his face than one who bears Pharos in his looks." And that's just speaking of the fact that our joy and the way we express our joy through our body and through our mouth, through our facial expressions. Cana, if you look at the text, you will see it. Cana of Galilee, we're told in John 21 verse 2 that Nathanael came there. So it's very likely that it's because of Nathanael that Jesus and several of the apostles were invited to this wedding. We're going to raise a question that can't be answered in the sermon about others, but Cana of Galilee is given to us. Probably this is the hometown and perhaps friends or family of Nathanael. The marriage feast and the ceremony were held on the same evening. There was the escort of the couple through the streets to their home, usually at night, as we read from the Mishnah. Torches were used, great exuberance expressed. Do you see the reality or the good thing of having this at night? Light just adds something to the atmosphere, doesn't it? Even if it's just beginning to get dark, there's something about the adding of the torches and the light that would be exuded there. Usually an open house, people would come and go, again, many times for a whole week. As they proceeded, they wore crowns. Those involved were dressed in bridal robes, and they wore them for the week. They didn't go on a honeymoon, but they stayed in the house, and usually they were dressed during that short period of time as king and queen. So just an honor given to them in that circumstance. Hospitality was emphasized. The host took great care to be sure that everyone's need was met. I don't have time to say it in the sermon, but when we read the text, we're going to see the concern that Mary had. They're almost out of wine. Have you ever had company and did not have enough food for the people who were there? No one want to admit to that? One of the great concerns that people who host in their home and fix a meal is to be certain that there's plenty. China, the custom, I never followed it, and I told our students, we would take 10 or 12 students out for lunch every week, at least once. And I would tell them, I'm not giving in to the Chinese custom. Good manners is to leave something on your plate. You leave something on your plate, which is basically saying thank you for what you provided, and it doesn't give the impression that they did not provide enough. I would tell our students that I'm teaching you American culture, and American culture is if you are wanting to and you're able, you clean your plate. But Mary in the text is very, very concerned because they're out of line. And what she says and what comes about is the lesson this morning. It is a big deal. I frankly don't know how the ladies on Wednesday night manage, unless they eat a whole lot of leftovers when they get home between Wednesday night and maybe Sunday or the next Wednesday. Those who prepare food, the concern is to be sure you have plenty and you don't want to run out. We used to tell our students, and when we would be with them, and we tell people even today, we've had several of you in, if you don't like what we fixed, we have peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And that is our way of making sure that you have something to enjoy eating. And if you don't like what we fixed, and we've only had 2 people over 53 years take us up on it, usually a child, Mom, can I have a peanut butter and jelly? Terry hears it, she's up in a flash to fix that child a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. You want hospitality, you want to have sufficient food, sufficient drink in this case, when you're looking at John chapter 2. Historians believe, and I can't refute it, that Joseph had probably died by now. He's not mentioned in the Gospels. As you move into the first public ministry Acts and then the Acts of Jesus, 3.5 years. So here's, when we get to the wedding feast, we'll make comments about the person, Jesus, in that circumstance. But Joseph is not in the picture, and it's not for a dubious cause. He had probably passed. And historians are pretty clear that that was the case. I depend on Wayne Jackson when I want some certainty on matters of opinion. He has a way of giving you a good overview of a situation to where you can explain it, you can understand it, and then it's up to you whether or not you choose to believe it or act upon it. When Paul gave direction for choosing elders and deacons, Timothy and Titus, not given to much wine is part of that. And not given to much wine has been subject to a great deal of conversation. Drunkenness, there's no question that to be drunk is not at all what God is pleased with. And I was told as a young teenager that you can't get drunk if you don't take the first drink. Or you can't find out if you like it if you don't take the first drink. Or you can't get hooked on it and become addicted to the alcohol in alcoholic beverages if you don't take the first drink. Now, hold your breath and don't be shocked, but I think I have drunk a mixed drink on one occasion. I don't know that to be the case for certain, but that's the only time that I've ever drunk wine, except for at a one cup congregation with relatives in Waco who use 1 cup and wine as the fruit of the vine. And I don't like it. I sip as little as I can. I don't know why people would drink it. But I was a sports editor of the newspaper at Middle Tennessee State University for 3 years. And we put out 2 newspapers a week, and it was a part-time job for me. And at the end of each year in the spring, they will celebrate. The staff will be there finishing the last edition and celebrate. And I remember many months later, for some reason it came to mind, someone asked me if I wanted a Coke. And I was rarely there. I went in, I did my work, and I had other things to do. But someone brought me a Coke. And later I told Terry, I bet there was something in that Coke. It didn't affect me, I didn't taste it. And that's why some people mix alcohol with some type of sweetened beverage like Coke or Pepsi. I don't want to drink wine. I don't plan to drink wine. I didn't know if I did that one time or not. But drunkenness is taught against in Scripture. There's no question. And if you look at the word onos, the word for wine, it's used many times in different ways in the Bible. And I've always made the point that people who would use John chapter 2 as an excuse for drinking alcoholic beverages aren't understanding, first of all, what took place, why it took place, and they're decided on something that I'm not certain, and most people aren't, that you can say that it was strong fermented wine. The Palestinian wine, history tells us, is 3 parts water and 2 parts wine. So the fermentation level is very different because of that. And many people suggest that in Jewish celebrations, and historians tell us, and writers like Wayne Jackson research it, it's not a high fermentation to where you're going to get drunk on it. I don't recommend ever drinking something that could become addictive. I don't ever recommend it. And I certainly don't encourage you to drink to the degree that you get drunk. And you can't get drunk unless you start drinking. And that's where most people who at least try to be fair with the expressions, the words, and the history will come. Something within my brain as I was talking. You'll come back up in a moment. We were studying miracles of Jesus, as we are this miracle. And I happened to have the assignment at West Broward in South Florida, this miracle. And I knew that we had members among our 400 plus that were social drinkers. And I addressed it as best I could and did not encourage it. I just thought of what I wanted to say. When we were in campus ministry, a young freshman woman came up to me and she said, I have to tell you something, Gary, and I had just barely met her. She said, I tasted an alcoholic beverage last night for the first time, and it scared me because I liked it. I liked it. And I discouraged it, and it scared her. It scared her, and that's one of the things to be concerned about. When we studied this, I chose to bring it up. And there were several comments about it after the Sunday morning classes, and we rotated through 5 adult classes, so I would teach it 5 times to each of the adult classes, and the other assignments were carried out in a similar way. So I ordered Bible Wines, 7 copies, and gave it to the elders at the next elders meeting. And one of the elders, who was the chairman that week, says, Gary, why are you bringing this to us? I said, because there was a whole lot of concern raised as it came up in my class, and it continued after class, and I felt like this could be good information for you to have. And he looked at me straight into my eyes. He says, what would happen if you knew that some of us elders were social drinkers? Do you think it would matter? I said, if you give me 80 seconds, I can name 80 families that would be concerned. Nothing else was said about it. They didn't ask for the first one, but it would have been a concern of that congregation. Some suggest that it's something that if you do it, you should keep it private. And as long as it's not done in public, your influence is part of the reason that social drinking can become an issue. Your influence. What if nobody knows it? What if it's done only in your house? And that's a legitimate statement. There's all kinds of things that come up, but most of the scholars, most of our fellowship, and those like Wayne Jackson who write about such topics because during his life, and now they're on his website, were asked, then he wrote about it in 2 articles, and I want to share some of his comments. The Roman statesman Cato, if you wish to have much grape juice all year, put grape juice in an amphora and seal the cork with pitch, sink it in a fish pond. After 30 days, take it out. It will be grape juice for a whole year. And that was his way of saying how they would preserve unfermented grape juice. And he wrote about it. Jack Lewis of our fellowship, wine was ordinarily used at the Passover, and it called fruit of the vine in Barakoth 6.1. And so he uses, it was used and where it was used, but of course that doesn't prove that this was a high alcohol wine that was produced by Jesus. All the wines of Bible times, Professor R. Laird Harris, all the wine of Bible times was like wine, not fortified with extra alcohol. Concentrated alcohol was only known in the Middle Ages when the Arabs invented distillation. It's the word alcohol, which is an Arabic word. So what is now called liquor or strong drink, whiskey, gin, and the 20% fortified wines were unknown in Bible times. Beer was brewed by various methods, but its alcoholic content was light. The strength of alcohol will be half of the percentage of the sugar in the juice. And if the alcoholic content is much above 10 or 11%, the yeast cells are killed and fermentation ceases. Probably ancient wines were 7 to 10%. Do you know most of us grew up taking in 3 to 6% alcohol in cough syrup? So it's not so much a part of cough syrups now, but alcohol had value. They figured out how to make it more appealing to those of us who don't like the taste and therefore would rather cough. But again, low percentage. To avoid the sin of drunkenness, mingling of wine with water was practiced. This dilution, that's a strange word all of a sudden, was specified by the rabbis in New Testament times by the wine customary at Passover. Wayne Jackson makes his typical statement when he writes about such topics. He said, this interpretation is not one that should be pressed as a matter of doctrine or fellowship. Don't make it a matter of doctrine or fellowship, but understand that the Bible wine in John chapter 2 was probably very low of alcohol, could not have been drunk, and there's a statement made that proves it. We'll see it in the sermon. But just be mindful, it's not something worth our fellowship stand, certainly not over a doctrine, when so little is said except drunkenness. Drunkenness is not condoned in any form in the Bible by any action, if you will. One thing that usually comes up, 1 Timothy 5 verse 23, the idea of taking a little wine for his stomach's sake. Paul was writing to Timothy. Apparently it was something that he knew was the issue with him, and it was used for medicinal purposes. It seems to suggest that he had been resistant to using a little wine to take care of a medical circumstance, and Jesus was basically saying, you need to think about it. But he had an ailment, and a little wine along with water would provide a medicinal benefit that Jesus seemed to suggest. An issue that comes up in our country, last I heard, I think it's 9 states have made marijuana legal. It will soon be more. Politicians can't turn down the millions of dollars of taxes that can be raised. And when something is available for medicinal purposes, it's very normal for people to then to be tempted to use it for social purposes. I know of 2 people who were struggling with serious cancer issues, and the doctor gave them a prescription for medical marijuana, and they hesitated to use it. And then with time, they realized, I've got to use it. The pain is unbearable. And I made the statement when we were in Vallejo that something prescribed and used moderately for medical purpose should not be frowned upon. But the problem is some people won't control themselves, and they may have a tendency to want to use it for recreational purposes. I got a phone call that week from one of our members who wanted to come over and visit with me. And he says, Gary, I was shocked that you mentioned in class this morning that medical marijuana might be something that we should consider. And I was shocked because I struggled with marijuana for a number of years in my life. And I didn't need to hear that. I said, did you think what I said gave you permission to go use it again? No. Did you know me back then, and had anyone had medical marijuana available to them back then that you just described? Well, no. And I said, why are we sitting here? He said, well, I just wanted to share with you that it's something that some of us struggled with. I had a dear friend in Florida at the Westbriar congregation, went to the University of Florida. And he was on drugs for a number of weeks, maybe months, when he was a student in Gainesville. He went to a dentist while in Florida with us, when we knew him. He had children. He was married. It had been 20 plus years. But something in the anesthetic that he was given to have dental surgery sent his brain and the chemicals just into a whirlwind. He literally spent over a month in a place that they treated people with mental disorder, and some of them were legally insane. The chemicals that were still in his brain, apparently from 20 plus years back, acted upon that medicine that he was given for dental surgery. I went and visited him, and we were real concerned about him to understand what has happened. And finally, they figured it out that that's probably what happened. Another reason not to use drugs if you need one. He did eventually come home, and he's just fine. The chemicals, whatever needed to take place, took place, and he came back to his normal self, but it took a while. And I'm not sure there was a guarantee how long it would take. It was a scary time for him. If you look at 1 Timothy 3:3 and Titus 1:7, Paul affirms that the candidate for bishop, and again, elder, overseer, shepherd, the same office, not be addicted to wine. That's the New American Standard. And a lot of people are looking for reasons, and they're looking for loopholes. And not to be addicted is not suggesting that you can't drink a little bit, people are quick to say. And yet we should not use the Bible talking about something that was probably not high in alcohol as an excuse for perhaps for some of the things that we would like to be involved in. If you look at those same verses there, the word there is nepho, translated sober. It means to be free from the influence of intoxicants. Vines tells us. So again, Wayne Jackson goes to the original language, he goes to lexicons and word studies to give us opportunities to better understand it. Josephus used the word nephilos, sobriety of the priest, as they function in their appointed roles, commenting that they are not permitted to drink wine. And that's in the Antiquities. The word literally means holding no wine, again from a theological dictionary. Have I dug myself in a hole that I need to climb out of? I'm willing to ask that.
I haven't heard you mention that the water back then wasn't especially good.
That's something that's never written about that I see from this time of the place.
The water was bad. I mean, they just had open wells. Your surface water is what they were drinking.
Yeah. I've heard that, but it's in countries even today. When you travel in other countries, the water is not clean. And if you're going to drink something, the many times they'll drink a table wine. Doesn't mean it's high in alcohol, doesn't mean it can make you drunk. But the condition of the water, I've not seen it written about in Bible context, but it's certainly real in countries all over the world.
There had to be some drinking going on in the church because when they were picking out elders, and one of the things that they mentioned, not giving too much wine.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think there was some of that went on because what he's speaking about.
Yeah.
It was just kind of an everyday life, and it was a low, kind of like grape juice.
Yeah, it was low alcohol, and again, the word wine doesn't mean fermented. It can be grape juice, such as this. We've worshipped at only one other one-cup congregation, and they use grape juice. I've got to tell you the story. When Terry and I married, we graduated, went and worked for a year in Chattanooga, and then drove west to visit her family across the west. And we stopped at that congregation in Waco for that Sunday morning. And the vessel that held a little bit of wine that I was to sup from for communion that Sunday morning, the cup was this far from my mouth, literally this far from my mouth, before Terry realized, oh no, I haven't told him that it was real wine. She intended to warn me, and it got my attention, and I sipped very little on purpose, whatever it was. But she was scared to death that I was going to choke even for a light sup of the real wine that they used in their assembly. I've chosen not to argue with him about it. Now, I don't believe at Passover, and the biblical backgrounds don't tell us that it was high fermented juice that could cause someone to become inebriated. So I think they have taken the one cup and not really considered the other ramifications of it, if you will. But I'm not going to get drunk on one little sip. So it's not worth the argument, but I could very much encourage them to buy something different. We had different people, as we do here at West Broward, sign up to do communion. And one Sunday, communion was served, and it was very clear that someone was not pleased with it. And in asking, found out that they had not bought Welch's grape juice, but they bought name brand grape juice. And it was not as good. And several ladies noticed it. And they made sure in a private conversation, those of you who do the communion cups, and when you buy grape juice, buy Welch's. The other had more water in it in their mind. And I laugh about that constantly when this subject would come up about what would be used there and what, of course, is used in a congregation. Has that ever come up here? The brand name of the grape juice? One time, there you go. One time, I'm not surprised. It tastes watered down to some people if it's not Welch's. And I don't think any disfellowshipping took place. I hope not. Apparently, most of you didn't know that this had happened one time. No disfellowshipping over that. But it's a topic for discussion. Comments? I want to save John 2 as best as I can for the larger audience and put it in the context of other things that are brought up here. Chris, good to have you and Cindy here. Chris still is able to do plumbing work, keeping his license, and I've encouraged him to for sure keep that. It's just a good thing. What do you want to comment
I
on?
was just gonna, you touched on it a little bit, but I was just, thinking about those arguments against, or arguments for drinking in John 2. That's like you said, it's a lack of understanding what was going on, because I can't remember how many barrels that he made of wine. So not only are you saying that Jesus was a part of this drunken party, the Son of God is a part of the drunken party, he's supplying all the alcohol. He's
Yeah.
supplying the drunkenness.
Yeah, well, I'll mention it because obviously the time gets by pretty quick. A statement is made in John 2 verse 10. Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. That's a poor translation. The better translation, their fill of it, but you have saved the best till last. Some people suggest that suggests the quality of his wine, and it was the very best. But what they're failing to acknowledge is that if you are getting drunk, you don't have your taste that much any longer, I've been told. And they had the ability in drinking this wine that Jesus produced to realize it's the best. It's the best I've ever had.
I heard somebody teach once before in class,
Yeah.
talking about, promoting alcohol and that, Jesus doing that miracle. They were trying to say that it promoted
Right.
drinking. And, really, if you think back to the customs of the time and that situation, that was the family would lose face. I mean, they would just be embarrassed to get out and leave if they ran out of food or wine or whatever. And Jesus, I think he was being more of a servant and more of a friend by doing that and trying to help them instead of them being embarrassed.
Well, that's certainly part of the social structure of that time. It would be here as well, because that's why I brought it up. If you've ever had company and ran out of food. But to suggest that this authorizes strong drink when it probably was not strong drink is just looking for an excuse and finding three little words that give you that excuse. Too many things about the culture and too much about the situation would dissuade us from using this text as a reason for what could be drink that could lead to drunkenness. That's probably not the case. Other comments or questions? I don't want to leave it hanging. I'm the one that stepped out on this ledge here.
Years ago when we were in Frost, years ago when the internet wasn't very common or maybe even didn't exist, you relied solely on printed commentaries type thing, especially, and we had, someone brought up after the preacher had a discussion like this, and anyhow, we had multiple meetings, 8 or 10 guys would get together and we'd sit and talk and all have our commentaries and opinions. And finally we weren't getting anywhere, and somebody said, well, Wayman Swain, who was teaching it or preaching in Bastrop at the time, he was noted in the area as a Greek scholar, or at least prominent among the brotherhood locally.
Sure.
So we made arrangements to go down and meet with him, and we walked in, and I remember I had an armful of commentaries in my Bible, and everyone else was loaded up. And we sat down at the conference table at Central, and everyone had a prayer, and then everyone looked at him, and he said, I know why we're here, and I don't know. We were a little disappointed in me, needless to say. Of course, he went on, and it was beyond that, but
But he made a good point.
yeah, he said, I don't know.
He made a good point.
What about, that Pentecost, they were speaking in tongues, and they accused, they thought they were drunk. So it must be something that really wasn't well common. And somebody, I think, said that it was too early, like a moment to get drunk later in the day.
Yeah.
If it was alcoholic, they did have access to alcohol, but it would make you drunk, or they wouldn't have been accused of it.
Yeah. Again, I think we're just, some are looking for an excuse. Can you stop this? I'm gonna make a comment, but I don't want it on tape.